Welcome to Liberty Starship, where we go beyond the typical terrestrial talk. I am Eric Alexander, along with Peter Maines. Together, we are your crew and invite you to join us on the journey to discuss politics and current events. And as we often do, today we are going to start off with a daily distraction. The daily distraction hashtag has multiple meanings. In this case, this story just doesn't seem to really fit the narrative of any of our other stories today. But I thought it was interesting, and I thought it was relevant to the Liberty community and to people at large. So let me get my share screen going here. We're going to be talking about Starlink. And this is a story I actually had wanted to talk about last week because that's when this was first breaking. But we had a really great program last week where we interviewed Arizona GOP Secretary Cindy Love. And we actually took the entire hour for that segment, so I didn't get to follow up. I didn't get to follow up with this, but there has been a more recent article and another twist on this story since last week when it first broke. So this is from decrypt.com, and it says Elon Musk invites users to test Starlink space internet. The SpaceX CEO now has 500 satellites orbiting Earth and is primed for internet broadband trials this summer. And for those that were not aware, summer actually started on Saturday. That was the summer solstice, so we are officially in summer. It says, in brief, SpaceX has announced that it's looking for beta testers for its Starlink satellite constellation. The startup has launched 500 satellites into Earth's orbit this year with the aim of providing internet coverage to most of the world by 2021. It plans to begin trial of the space-based internet broadband platform this summer. So what we're seeing now is that SpaceX, of course, has been in the news quite a bit. We've talked about the launch of the Dragon spacecraft to the International Space Station. We've talked about their Starship, not the Liberty Starship, but the SpaceX Starship that they're planning to use to colonize possibly the moon and Mars. And now we're talking about Starlink and the fact that they are going to begin trials for this service. But this move is not without controversy. I'm not sure, Pete, if you had heard, but there are people that are complaining, especially astronomers complaining, that we may be looking at an unprecedented amount of space junk because of all these satellites that they plan to put up. This is only the beginning. This is the beta. This is the 500 satellites for the very beginning of the test. And I believe they're looking at places like Canada and maybe the northern United States, some of the more northern regions of Europe. They're looking at rural areas as opposed to urban areas. But eventually, this network is going to be much, much larger. And I'm not sure if you had heard about this controversy, Pete, about some folks being upset that this satellite network may block their view of the stars.
I did hear about that. I heard another complaint was possibly that this could trigger what's known as Kessler syndrome, which is basically all the satellites fall out of the sky. We suddenly go back to the Stone Ages because there's just too much floating around the Earth. I don't know how close we are to being in danger of that. My hope is that we're not very close, but the fact that these are low Earth orbit satellites, you never know. Yeah. Now,
SpaceX does have an answer to this. They do say that they're going to be providing these satellites with some sort of shielding that is supposed to help with that, as far as the stargazing aspect, not necessarily the space junk aspect. In fact, I haven't really heard a lot of people talk about the space junk aspect, which actually I think is more serious than the fact that some stargazers might have an obstructed view of the galaxy now. But they are talking about sunshades. Here it is. It says, but these ambitious plans have drawn fire from stargazers. They complain that light pollution is a feature of the mega constellations because of the bright trails they leave across the night sky. SpaceX has promised to fit sunshades to the satellites to help solve this problem. But it doesn't really address the space junk problem that you just brought up. That I haven't heard anybody really talk about.
Well, maybe Space Force can use the space junk for target practice.
Well, it's funny. That I think that's a funny joke, Pete. But it actually brings up a larger point. This is obviously Liberty Starship. We talk about Liberty views. SpaceX is a private company, and they are doing this as a private company. They are starting the service. They're sending satellites up on their own, of course, with approval from the FAA and other organizations. But we don't have an official regulatory government space agency at this time. And a lot of people, of course, compare Space Force to, Starfleet and Star Trek, and things like that. And a lot of people have thought, could this be the beginning of something like that? And it does, in terms of a more serious debate that I think is going to be occurring for decades, perhaps centuries. We're going to have to be looking at whether that's going to happen, whether we are going to eventually have some sort of Starfleet, some sort of regulatory body, and even an enforcement body for space.
What about, this is maybe it's a silly question, but what about the FAA and NASA? Why can't they regulate that?
Well, they're not international bodies. That's my point.
International. Okay.
Yeah, they're not international. But obviously, Starfleet is a it's a multi-planetary organization in the fictional world of Star Trek. But right now, we don't. We do have. I know there's some agreements. There's international treaties that apply to space. Things like you're not supposed to put nuclear weapons in space. But these are international treaties. And I know the UN does have some sort of office on space. But it's essentially a toothless organization. And so you kind of have to wonder, like you just said, for instance, if someone, let's just surmise in the future that a company might put a satellite up there without authorization. Who shoots it down? Who's responsible for taking it down? How do you take it down? These are actually valid questions, I think, for the future.
Yeah. Well, yeah, there are dozens of international organizations kind of like that, right? The IMF, the WTO. But the problem always is, how do you enforce it? The UN doesn't have a military. They certainly don't have a space force or anybody who could, would have the equipment or the authorization to take down space junk. So, yeah, that's a serious concern.
And that rolls into the whole issue of anti-satellite weapons as well. That the United States, China, and Russia are the only countries I'm aware of that have those capabilities. But that also brings brings that whole issue into focus as well. So this issue has wider repercussions as this continues, because I think as this is just the beginning. They plan to put many, many more satellites into orbit. And so the issue of the folks having their obscured views and also the space junk issue, it's just going to get bigger, I think.
Well, speaking of big controversies, SCOTUS has been at the center of a couple of controversies over the past week, and you probably have heard of them. It's the DACA ruling and the so-called Bostock ruling, which has to do with what is the meaning of sex discrimination. Well, I wanted to clear up some misconceptions, because I've taken a look at the rulings. I took a look at least at the syllabi for the two rulings, and there's a lot less there than meets the eye. The media has been hyping these as big, game-changing decisions, and they just aren't that. The DACA ruling, which is, of course, deferred action for children, as opposed to DAPA, which was the parents of arrival. So DACA, child arrivals, and DAPA for parent arrivals. The ruling was very narrow. What the Supreme Court actually ruled was that the Trump administration had not followed the APA, the Administrative Procedure Act, in removing DACA. Not that they couldn't do it, but that they hadn't followed the APA. Now, so you mentioned this on Twitter. Why can't a president undo the executive order of a previous president? And the answer is they can. And this isn't exactly an executive order. It's called it's called administrative guidance. So to sort of sum it up, the executive branch is responsible for executing the laws. So Congress passes laws, the executive branch puts them into force. The Obama administration says we're not going to enforce the law against these people, which arguably is unconstitutional, but that wasn't the question before the Supreme Court last week. The question...
I would argue strongly that that's unconstitutional, by the way.
Well, executive orders aren't in the Constitution. And does Congress have any say in how their orders are enforced? I would say they do. That's the point of them passing laws, is they're the ones making policy.
Well, the issue that I have there is, for instance, with when you talk about law enforcement in general, obviously the executive branch has a lot to do with policy. They have a lot to do with deciding how those laws are going to be enforced, because they determine how those resources are allocated. But that's not what happened in DACA. DACA wasn't a situation where, for instance, the Obama administration made a directive to ICE and said, listen, when it comes to enforcing these immigration laws on people in this particular situation, these children that have been in here for years, we're just not going to focus resources on that. We're not going to focus our resources on that. That is a legit executive role. In principle, that's no different than doing high traffic enforcement versus saying, you know what, we have to put our resources in this, drug infested, gang ridden area of town. You know what I mean? So you allocate your resources to where you think the problem is. And then obviously other laws, as a result, are not going to be enforced as strictly because resources are always limited. Right. That, to me, is perfectly permissible. The problem with DACA was that it actually enacted regulations that were contrary to the law and provided a process for people that was not provided for by Congress.
And what's really interesting about that, you're right about that. It was unconstitutional. However, at the time that the Supreme Court ruled on that, there were only 8 justices on the bench because Anton Scalia had just died. So what happened was the Supreme Court deadlocked 4-4, and basically the lower courts ruled on it. Judge Roberts ruled that DACA was implemented unconstitutionally. And he ruled the same way this time, that both actions, both Trump's action and was illegal, and that Obama's action was unconstitutional. But unfortunately, because of the 4-4 deadlock, his ruling had no effect. If it's 4-4, the lower courts make policy, and so in effect, this unconstitutional use of executive power by President Obama was allowed to stand, which is a farce. But it was just timing. It's very unfortunate. Now, here's the thing: the president has said, he said on Twitter, we have to start from square one. Well, that's absolutely right. There is nothing stopping the Trump administration from going through the process of they have to give an official explanation for what they're doing. They have to then have to allow a comment period. And the thinking is this. Are you familiar with the Chevron doctrine, Eric?
I am not.
Okay. The Chevron doctrine says that the executive branch gets the first crack at interpreting the law before the courts do, and that the courts should defer to the executive branch if it's reasonable. And this is essentially part of that. It's been codified by Congress, an official process for allowing the executive branch to say, this is what we think the law means. We're the ones who have to enforce it. So, we have the most stake. The courts can make all kinds of crazy rulings because they don't actually have to worry about, does this ruling make sense? And then they can just throw that mess back to the executive branch. This is a process that allows the executive branch to, in a controlled, structured way to exert their responsibility to interpret the law before the courts do. So to prevent the courts from just going willy-nilly and making rulings that can't be carried into practice. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. I don't think it's necessarily being followed, but it makes sense.
Yeah. So
because we've seen multiple preemptive actions by courts,
right?
Especially with Trump, when he's issued an executive order, we've seen courts say, "Nope, you can't do that." I don't necessarily believe that doctrine's being followed.
No, but they are supposed to give the utmost deference to the executive branch, but they don't always. The other one is Bostock. A lot of people are losing their minds about this, and I'll follow in our final segment. I'm going to talk a little bit about this, but essentially, in Bostock, they ruled. A lot of people said, "Hey, these are Trump appointees. This is a Trump appointee. Why did he rule against the president? Why did he rule against conservatism? This is Gorsuch, who wrote the Bostock ruling. And there were 3 cases that were rolled into one. And the one I think is the most straightforward had to do with a transgender woman, a male to female, someone going through that transition, wanted to wear the uniform, their work uniform of a woman at work. And what the courts ruled was to not allow that person to wear a female uniform was sex discrimination. And, if you think about it, that could apply not just to people who are transsexual or transgender, but to any uniform policy. You don't have to declare that you are transitioning or not. It doesn't matter. They were sort of robotically applying the letter of the law that this is sex discrimination. Now, is it pernicious? I mean, I don't think it's pernicious to have a female uniform and a male uniform. If airlines have it for stewardesses or flight attendants, but is it technically discrimination? Well, it technically is. Was that what the original intent of the law was? No, absolutely not. And the question is then, well, what happens the next time they go at say admissions to college, and they say, okay, you have affirmative action, you have race-based admissions, which the courts have ruled against a number of times, and then the schools have kind of reeled it back a little bit and tried to massage it. Oh, we have this different formula for Latino students or Black students or white students. The next time the court rules on this, you now have all of the liberal justices on record endorsing a textualist interpretation of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So it'll be interesting to see how they unwind that, because it seems to me that they've really painted themselves into a corner on that issue.
It seems just bizarre to me, what's happening sometimes with some of these rulings, because clearly the intent of the anti-discrimination laws had nothing to do with your uniform. I mean, that's something. Women's bodies are different than men's bodies, and there's I mean, the military obviously has uniforms for females and uniforms for males. Right. A lot of it is fairly unisex. I mean, for instance, wearing a skirt is an option usually for female officers and enlisted folks. It's not something that's generally required unless they're trying to literally be uniform and they all agree and all that kind of stuff. Right. But it seems kind of silly to me. So it seems to me what we're headed towards is that everything has to be unisex. And I'm sure that was not the intention of the law. The intention of the law was not that everybody has to have a unisex uniform. Oh God, I hope this does not affect Hooters. Just please don't let it affect Hooters, this ruling, because that's going to be terrible. That's disgusting. So
Well, there was a court case against Hooters about 10 years ago. And basically what happened was Hooters shamed the man bringing the lawsuit into dropping his lawsuit by putting out full-page ads in newspapers of men wearing Hooters uniforms. Oh, okay.
I am aware of that, Pete. That's why I brought it up. I thought it was funny. But yes, I am aware of that. Yeah. Well, I think society shamed him as well, because nobody wants to see that. I mean, that's just the bottom line. So
yeah, but he was making a political point. I don't think he actually wanted to work at Hooters. But but think about it. If you had separate uniforms for white and Black employees, would that be a violation of the 1964 Civil Rights Act?
Oh, I think so. Yeah, absolutely. Because I think that's but there's a fundamental difference here that we have to understand between race and gender. And that's what we're having a culture war about right now that I think is ridiculous. I mean, I'm just going to say it. I think it's a ridiculous fight, because I'm not it's not that I'm not sympathetic to transgender people, and it's not that I don't understand that. But these issues, I think, for the most part, should be addressed privately. And if you have an issue with it, you always have the option of saying, "Hey, I'm not going to go to this business because of this policy. I'm not going to buy anything from them." I think there's a lot of overreach when it comes to a lot of these anti-discrimination laws in the workplace, because they're being used for things they clearly were never intended to be used for. I just don't believe they were ever meant for this law to be used to say you can't have male and female uniforms and decide who gets to wear them.
Well, you're right, and the Supreme Court. Right. And the Supreme Court actually agrees with you on that point. But what Gorsuch has said is that it doesn't matter what the original intent was, that what matters is what the law actually says. And so even your point is well taken.
I don't agree with that either. See, that's a fundamental issue, and it surprises me, that's the interpretation, because, I was always taught in history class, government class, social studies consistently, growing up as a child, that the entire point of the judiciary is to basically interpret the law so that they apply it the way that it was intended. It's not about the letter of the law; it's about the spirit of the law, right. And that's why we have courts. That's the only reason we have courts. But it seems more and more to me that's not what they do. There's this notion that as times change and culture changes, well, now we have to apply the law differently. I think that's garbage. That's just me.
Right. Well, that's the big difference between the textualists and the originalists on the court. And you have people. Gorsuch obviously identifies as a textualist. Some of the other conservative justices do as well. Elena Kagan, who's on the left, now identifies in some circumstances as a textualist. But other Supreme Court justices on the right, I believe Clarence Thomas, calls himself an originalist, although he does worry about the role of the letter of the law as well. Now the thing with the left is that many of those left-leaning justices over the past century have said, yes, the spirit of the law, the living Constitution, but they don't mean the original intent. They mean given current circumstances, given current political mood. Yeah. That's a very different thing.
That's what I'm talking about. That's what I really disagree with and I think is wrong. I do believe that the letter of the law does, have relevance. I'm not saying it's irrelevant, but I'm saying if you can argue it either way, you need to go back to what did the framers of that law actually intend and rule in that regard. What issue were they trying to, address? What problem were they trying to solve? And that's what I think. That's what I think the courts are for. But I think the courts are ignoring that more and more and more.
Well, I just wanted to hit one last point before we move on, and we're going to have to skip over police reform because we don't have enough time. We've gone over on this segment, but the other cases had to do with gay men who had been fired from their jobs, ostensibly on the basis of their sexual orientation. Now, the courts actually didn't rule on that because that wasn't the question before them. The question was, is it illegal to fire somebody on the basis of sexual orientation? So they didn't have to adjudicate the facts. They just had to adjudicate the principle, if that makes sense. That's why all these cases were lumped together, because the Supreme Court is not ruling on three cases simultaneously. They're just being asked, what is the principle that courts have to rule by? Okay. So they ruled that you cannot fire somebody on the basis of sexual orientation because it intersects with sex. And it kind of the same issue as the last one we talked about. But here's where it gets really interesting. In those cases, at least one of them, the person who was fired was accused of embezzlement and almost certainly was not fired because of sexual orientation. Not that it doesn't happen, but in this particular case, it looks like his lawyers are just throwing spaghetti against the wall, hoping that they could make it about sexual orientation so they could take the spotlight off of his embezzling of, I believe it was over $500,000. So that's just funny how that works out.
I guess he has a good lawyer. He's going for anything he possibly can to save his client. But I will say, Pete, don't you see that there's an irony here, in that it seems like in one circumstance the court is saying, well, you need to have a literal interpretation of the law when it comes to this circumstance, but in the other circumstance you're saying, no, don't use the literal language of the law. We're going to interpret this as applying to sex. And of course, sexual orientation does not apply to sex for the letter of the law. Sex is not about orientation. Sex is about being male or female. It has nothing to do about your sexual orientation. That's not in the law. So what they're saying is they're sort of expanding the definition of sex to include your sexual orientation. And that's completely contrary to what we were just talking about, where they were saying, no, we have to take a literal interpretation of this uniform issue because this is what the law actually says.
Right. Well,
okay.
What Gorsuch said was, look, if a person is a man and he's in a relationship with a woman, that's okay. You know, that he would not be fired for being heterosexual. But if he is a man or let's say it's a woman in a relationship with another woman, the difference is the sex of the employee, and therefore, even though it's not, sexual orientation itself is not protected, the fact that the employer is treating the employee differently on the basis of sex, and I understand it's maybe you could argue it's kind of a strained interpretation, but he contends, rightly or wrongly, that this is a literal interpretation of the law.
Yeah, I don't see that. I think that they're talking out of both ends of their mouth there. That's not. To me, that's not consistent. That's trying to have your cake and eat it too. I don't know any other way to put it.
Yeah,
it just doesn't seem logically consistent to me. Yeah,
well, that's certainly the debate, and that's why Alito was so furious with the ruling. Now let's move on to your topic because we want to stay on schedule here.
Let's touch on the police reform just because it is related to the Supreme Court and just the fact that the absence of the ruling is related to the police reform issue because we did talk about this off the air. So the Supreme Court did not decide to review qualified immunity. The Supreme Court has punted. I think actually, in my opinion, it's a good punt because I do think it's more up to the legislature to reform qualified immunity rather than the courts. The court doctrine is well established. It's been ruled on many times, so the Supreme Court's not going to change its tune. So it's back up to Congress and it's up to the legislative branch to decide ultimately what happens with qualified immunity.
You're right about that. I think that's probably exactly why they didn't rule on it. It was because, as you said, it's well established, and because they know that it's likely that the legislature, that is Congress, will take it up in the near future. They don't want to get in the way of what Congress is doing. They don't want to make a ruling. Their time is valuable. They only rule on so many cases every year, and so to rule on something that may be ruled irrelevant here in the next few weeks or months or year. Is not a good use of their time as the court. So I agree. That was a good punt on the case of the Supreme Court. They weren't going to overrule it anyway. So what was the point?
But obviously, it does relate to the police reform issue. Now, in terms of something also that the Congress has not been taking action on that is actually, I think, kind of good. I had wanted to talk last week about the Patriot Act and FISA. And specifically, I have an op-ed piece here from from Senator Rand Paul, who I will tell everyone, yes, he is my favorite senator. I am biased. I don't agree with everything he says. There are definitely issues sometimes I don't agree with him, but for the most part, I do. And this is from last week. I didn't get a chance to share it. This is from the Washington Examiner, and this is an opinion piece that is authored by Senator Rand Paul. It says opinion, Senator Rand Paul, veto fake reform of the Patriot Act. So it says, in 2015, I filibustered reauthorization of the Patriot Act. My filibuster was not popular with other senators because it kept them in Washington over a Memorial Day weekend. I still remember one or two hotheads muttering and directing profanity under their breath. I have to admit, I may have given them right back some choice words of my own. A senior Republican in leadership admonished me that I'd be sorry if terrorists struck the United States while the Patriot Act was expired. I responded, quote, couldn't we just rely on the Constitution for a few hours like we did for over 200 years? Strum and drag, fear and more fear, always are disingenuously attached to the debate over the Patriot Act. Our dear leaders emotionally warn of impending terrorist calamity if Congress should restrict the Patriot Act's power to shift through American phone and business records. Fast forward 5 years, and the Patriot Act came up for reauthorization this spring. The only difference is Republicans and an occasional honest Democrat have discovered that the Patriot Act and its facilitator, the FISA court, were abused to conduct a partisan investigation of a major presidential candidate. The secret FISA court was used to issue secret warrants to spy on the Trump campaign. This knowledge became so widespread that simply sweeping it under the carpet became impossible. Instead, the defenders of the deep state conspired to put forth fake reform. The FISA would still be allowed to investigate political campaigns, but new procedural hurdles were put in place. Weak sauce, I say. I offered an amendment to exclude the FISA court from investigating Americans. My logic was that the FISA warrants do not require adherence to the Fourth Amendment. So FISA warrants shouldn't be issued for Americans. FISA warrants ask that a judge ascertain probable cause of someone being an agent of a foreign country, and the accused is not allowed to challenge or even know of the warrant. The Constitution and the Fourth Amendment requires that a judge ascertain probable cause of a crime, and the accused ultimately gets to challenge the warrant. Anything short of guaranteeing that each and every citizen gets the protection of the Fourth Amendment is weak sauce and an insult to people that want the abuse heaped on this president by the intelligent community to never happen again. My amendment failed. 11 constitutional conservatives voted for it, and not one Democrat could emerge from Trump derangement fog to support the Constitution. Funny thing, though, President Trump watched from afar and then threatened to veto the bill because it didn't really reform FISA. So 3 provisions of the Patriot Act, including Section 215's mass surveillance of Americans, have been expired for some 3 months. That's good news, folks. Perhaps we could go back to just living under the Constitution. I hope Trump will veto the weak sauce fake reform bill, as it does next to nothing to prevent another president from being abused by our intelligence community. In the meantime, everyone should remember Benjamin Franklin's admonition that those who trade their liberty for security may well wind up with neither. Had you read this opinion piece, Pete?
No, I hadn't, although I'm not entirely surprised by its contents. I followed the FISA issue not as closely as you have, but I've certainly followed it. And he's absolutely right. If we're so worried about the Constitution not being sufficient to protect us, why aren't they clamoring to modify the Constitution? Put forward an amendment. And I think the answer is because that would attract an awful lot of attention to add a 28th Amendment to the Constitution. Whereas these laws, whenever the Patriot Act is renewed, it's always been by lopsided margins of Congress. So you think, especially after 9/11, there was a lot of political will. They could have made it a constitutional amendment, and yet they just didn't. So you have to wonder about their motives. I think it was to keep it a little bit out of the spotlight.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. And there is a cynical part of me when it comes to reforms like reforms on the Patriot Act, or even revoking the Patriot Act and FISA and all these things. I believe the only reason that this debate is really happening in the way that it's happening is because the president got spied on. But the fact of the matter is, let's be honest, the president would probably love to spy on Biden. He'd probably love to spy on all sorts of political opponents. That's the problem with executive power, is nobody wants to give it up. That's what we've seen for at least over 100 years now, is the executive branch acquiring more and more power and being very reluctant to give it away, to give it back. We see this time and time again, and it's a very disturbing trend, and we don't seem to see a reversal in sight, except for this small victory right now, which is just because Congress really isn't doing anything. Thank the do nothing Congress sometimes, because sometimes when they don't do anything, that's better for us that are on the Liberty side.
Yeah. Well, good thing, Rand Paul is there. I'm glad that he seems to have an awful lot of influence with the president on this issue and others. Because honestly, I don't think that, aside from maybe Mike Lee, I don't think any other senators are really would have been willing to clue the president and clue Trump into what the implications are for him. They would have just quietly allowed this abuse to keep happening without reform. So, So
ultimately, we don't have an answer on this. This is really more of a delay. So this is going to be a story that I'm going to try to keep up on as we do get more of a definitive answer to what's going to happen with the Patriot Act, because they're not going to revoke it. They're going to do something with it. I'm guessing that they're going to try to do some sort of reform to quote unquote make sure that another political candidate isn't spied on in the manner that the Trump campaign was. But we'll see. I don't know. Like I said, the problem is no executive likes to give up power. That's just the nature of the game right now, and it's disturbing. It's a disturbing trend. Now, speaking of executives who like to seize power and that kind of issue here, we have the Maskup issue that's going on, and right now it's front and center in Arizona politics. For folks that don't know, recently Governor Ducey sort of changed course, and he decided that rather than have a uniform policy for the entire state, that he was going to allow counties and cities to come up with their own ordinances to combat the spread of COVID-19 with mask regulations. And this has caused quite a bit of controversy in the state of Arizona. It's caused quite a bit of controversy in the community where I live. I live in Scottsdale, Arizona, and we've been in the headlines for all the wrong reasons, it seems like, lately. And this is just another example of that. So it's interesting. I actually did a mini-sode this last week where I talked about, and by the way, it turned out to be more than a mini-sode because I was going through all the different ordinances of the cities and counties, and I ended up talking for like 40 minutes, which is way longer than I wanted to. But there's so many regulations. And by the way, this does fit into what the governor's original narrative was that, well, I would rather see a uniform policy for the entire state, because it does get confusing sometimes, because when cities and counties are enacting their own ordinances, it's hard to keep up with it. Like, you don't necessarily know, hey, I know the regulation in Scottsdale. In fact, I think I have it right up here to queue up for you so you can see what it says. I mean, here's the Scottsdale mandate right here. This is straight from the city of Scottsdale website. But the interesting thing about the Scottsdale ordinance, if you go to the actual proclamation, for instance, the part that I'm always interested in is the enforcement part. That's the part that I always have the laser focus on, is I want to see what's the teeth in this, if any. Well, if you go to the teeth, it's right here at the bottom. And it says private businesses and venues shall enforce this proclamation by asking any person failing to comply with the emergency proclamation to leave their premises. By allowing patrons to remain on the premises without a face covering as described above is a violation of this emergency proclamation. A continued failure to comply with an emergency proclamation by a business owner and or responsible party is a misdemeanor. Now, this is in contrast to the order from Maricopa County, because Maricopa County passed their own mask ordinance after this. They gave a $50 civil fine. It's a ticket. It's a ticket for $50. That's the worst they can do to you. But by the way, that still creates problems, because that means that an officer still has to detain you in order to issue the citation if they're going to enforce it. So I always feel that these enforcement mechanisms are very problematic. But the issue I have here, and with many of the communities in Arizona, including Scottsdale's in my focus. I'm going to try to focus a lot more on Scottsdale, because that's where I live. I really want to advocate for people to focus on their local politics more. This applies to protests, to police reform, to the COVID epidemic. We really have to be more involved in our local politics, and I'm going to try to be the change I want to see. So I'm going to start focusing on this issue more as far as it pertains to my local community. And the issue I have here is, why is this a proclamation by the mayor? I saw his tweet related to this. I shared it on our Twitter feed. He basically said, I'm consulting my lawyer. By the way, there's a lawyer, Sherry R. Scott, the city attorney. I'm consulting the lawyer, and I'm going to issue a proclamation. At this point, why can't he meet with the city council, ask for public input at a city council meeting, a public meeting, which they should have means by this time to have virtual discussions as well, where people can discuss virtually. They can go on camera or send some sort of a chat function. We have the technology, or people can show up with a mask on if they want. That's fine. But my point is, why does he have to do this emergency proclamation? And why are so many other mayors doing this? Phoenix didn't do this. In Phoenix, they had a vote by the city council to decide on their mask ordinance. Why are they doing this in Scottsdale and so many other communities? And Pete, I don't know if you have thought about that particular aspect of this story. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, I know exactly why it's a proclamation, because the election is coming up soon. And in Arizona, your city council is going to have 2, 3, or 4 city councilmen coming up for re-election. They may be allies of the mayor. And if they vote the wrong way, or simply, I mean, no matter how you vote is going to be the wrong way. Somebody's going to be mad at you. You're going to alienate some people by voting on this issue. And so what they're doing is they're giving political cover to their city councils because they don't want them to have to stick their necks out on a very controversial, contentious issue right in the 6 weeks before the election.
Yeah, I can see that. But so the question becomes, why didn't they do that in Phoenix?
Well, I mean, Mayor Gallego's out for herself. I don't know what to tell you. I do think that's it.
That's pretty funny, actually. But yeah. I have to say, me personally, I kind of give more credit to Phoenix and the way they did it, because they did go on the record, they did vote, at least. But the one thing I won't give them credit for was it was too fast. I think that there should be public input allowed on this. Like, for instance, you and I are in agreement that we advocate for masks. Both of us wear masks in public, and we both, and this forum advocates people wearing masks. We've done a segment about it where we talked about the science behind masks, and we advocate for masks. But I think where you and I, both kind of get into it starts to get a little dirty, is about mandatory masks ordinances. And also, in this particular instance, I'm talking about how the ordinance is actually enacted. I think we are way beyond emergency declarations, including for the state, by the way, for Governor Ducey. I think that issue, we should have had a special emergency session of the legislature. The legislature should have been able to weigh in on this issue. And if they want to create a state law that says you have to wear a mask, then put it on them. And the same thing at the city and the city level. We shouldn't be allowing mayors to do these proclamations. I pointed this out before. Mayors in most Arizona cities, and in fact, most cities in the Southwest and the West Coast, are very weak. Most city governments are manager councils, not mayor councils. In other words, the city manager is really the chief executive, even though he's a bureaucrat. That's just the way it is. That's the way these charters are. And one of the reasons I said earlier this is kind of a power grab is I can't help but be cynical and think a lot of these mayors feel relevant being able to issue these emergency proclamations, because city managers can't do that. That's one thing city managers can't do. They don't have that authority because they're not an elected official. So they can't issue emergency proclamations. They can't order anything. So other than employees, they order the employees to do things. That's how they exert their executive authority. The chief of police's boss is not the mayor. The chief of police's boss is the city manager. People don't realize that. But the mayor does have authority when it comes to emergency proclamations in most communities out here. So sometimes I get cynical and think that they just want to play a little dictator.
Yeah, I agree with you in principle that our legislatures, including our city councils, should debate this and should vote on this in public. There's no excuse not to. It's political cowardice not to. And I took a little jab at Mayor Gallego. As you all know, Marissa Hamilton's running against her, and we support Marissa for Phoenix mayor. But on this issue, I mean, she's right. They should have a vote on it. What I'm really worried about, though, you say it's a civil fine. You have to detain somebody. What happens when somebody flips out on a police officer? Because I'm just waiting for this to happen. And maybe I'm wrong about this, but it seems like, as contentious as this issue is, you have people who seem to be really worked up about masks. Doesn't it seem like, there's Marissa Hamilton.
But I like what she says here. The doctor-patient relationship is essential and should not be infringed by politicians. Yeah, I thought that was a good ad. And by the way, you notice there's a mask underneath her chin. She is not anti-mask. Right. She's got a mask underneath her chin right there for everybody to see. This is the kind of messaging that I like, personally.
Yeah. But, even if it's a civil offense, police officers are going to be involved. What happens if you don't pay the fine? Are we going to arrest people for not refusing to pay the fine? I don't know where this ends.
I'll be honest. My hope and kind of what I'm kind of hearing is they're just not going to enforce this. They're just not going to care. You know what I mean? The issue that I could see is, like, for instance, in Scottsdale. Scottsdale's a good example. They might have some sort of enforcement at the clubs, because we do have a big club industry in Scottsdale in the entertainment quarter. It's a mile away from my house. So, I could see something maybe happening there if they see a lot of egregious violations. But, ultimately, I'm a freedom person, and I believe, hey, if you don't want to be around people without masks, then don't go to places where people don't have masks. You know what I mean? So if you don't like what they're doing at this nightclub, well, don't go. You know what I mean? Don't support them. You know what I mean? And if you want to shame them on the internet, you can do that too. The problem I have is sending the police in and arresting people for the misdemeanor violation. Or for that matter, as you mentioned, if they're going to use the county ordinance and they're going to issue them citations, you still need to detain those people to issue the citation. And as you mentioned, that can still go bad. That can go very, very bad, very, very quickly.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. It will somewhere. Hopefully we don't see too many of those incidents. I haven't seen any signs of that happening so far. So maybe it's just they're not enforcing it. Maybe it's people are being reasonable and, but after the past couple weeks of, George Floyd and people tearing down statues and, you're like, oh, not another thing. Do we really need this right now?
Well, that's been my point that I haven't been able to make as I guess as succinctly as I would like, is that it's kind of like a forest fire, right? We're dealing with very dry wood. And I feel very strongly that a lot of what's happened with the George Floyd protests and everything is directly related to the lockdowns, because people were so tense, there was so much anxiety, and it was just like a forest fire. There was very dry wood. There was a lot of tinder. There's a lot of dead wood that was going on as a result of the lockdown. And so I think it's very easy for these situations to flare up out of control very, very quickly. And I just wanted to share one last thing, because I plan to cover this event. This actually made Newsweek. Arizona councilman asked citizens to protest mandatory face mask order. And we are going to be having a protest. Scottsdale City Councilman Guy Phillips is going to be protesting the mask order on Wednesday. So that's in my neighborhood. I just wanted to put out there that I do plan to cover this event. I'll probably use the Twitter, and I will probably live stream it as much as I can.
And not to minimize what happened to George Floyd, but a month earlier, the Ahmaud Arbery case was also very, what's even the word? Just so saddening. Such a terrible thing to happen. But that didn't cause riots. So maybe it was a matter of the tension finally at the time of George Floyd had built up to such a point because of the lockdowns, because of everything that's been going on, that's what finally was the spark that lit the fire. Because
I sincerely believe that, and I sincerely believe in that analogy. I really think that we were dealing with with a dead wood forest. You know what I mean? That's what the lockdowns created. They created an environment. We were already seeing protests against the lockdowns. Protests that I was not that comfortable with when I saw some of the things that they were doing, and then it just got worse. So I think the issues are related. I definitely think the issues are related.
All right. Well, we're one more issue that we want to hit before we sign off here is the whole John Bolton thing. John Bolton, and I want to kind of do something different because I think a lot of people have covered his explosive claims that the president allegedly endorsed concentration camps, which sounds, that's a pretty explosive claim. So I'll let other people debate those things. And just sort of, it seems like in a sane world that the conservatives would be against him. The Trump supporters would be against him, and the Biden supporters would be for him being Bolton. But what we've actually seen is that everybody hates Bolton. He got up and just everybody's hurling tomatoes, depending on it doesn't matter whether they're left, right, or center. So I just kind of wanted to talk about the meltdown. One particular person in particular, Sean Davis of the Federalist, has lost his freaking mind. In general, that's a news commentary site that has completely gone downhill. They've lost all objectivity. Gosh, I mean, there's so much here. I don't even know where to start. This is somebody who hated Trump. He called him a grifter. He said grifters going to grift, and scammers going to scam. He accused the president back in 2015 and 2016 of stealing money from veterans, something that I don't think was ever. I don't think that allegation was ever verified, ever validated. I think it was just one of those nasty stories that comes out during campaign season. He said that he was headed towards a brokered convention when it was obvious that he was the nominee. Called him a demagogue, accused him of saying, to be blunt, they were not great buildings. Donald Trump 7 days after 9/11, which again, that doesn't. I mean, if that's true, I don't know. It doesn't seem. It's a really nasty accusation to make. Let me put it that way. But then he's completely changed his tune. He's been completely pro-Trump since the nomination, essentially, and so let's see what they say today. Oh gosh, again, there's just too much here. Which quote do you start with? The Federalist loves Trump. They loved John Bolton back in 2019, June of last year. They said liberals are trying to goad Trump into firing his national security advisor, John Bolton, just when his foreign policy is showing some success. He shouldn't give them the satisfaction, implying that the deep state was after John Bolton. Then they attacked Jennifer Rubin as flip-flopping on Bolton. If not Bolton himself, somebody like him would be the ideal in the number 2 spot. So she wanted Bolton to be either the president or the vice president, and then she turned against him once he became the president's national security advisor. So they ran an ad saying, "Oh, Jennifer Rubin is such a hypocrite." Then they said that. It's hard when he was appointed. They said it's hard to imagine a better choice. So they loved Bolton, absolutely loved him. And over the past couple of days, Sean Davis and Molly Hemingway have done nothing on Twitter but bash Bolton, call him a liar, say that he's greedy, say that he's just cashing in, that he's a traitor. All of these things. They've completely changed their tune. And they see no irony. They see no irony for saying that Jennifer Rubin flip-flopped on Bolton. But okay, that kind of makes sense. They're pro-Trump. They don't like that that Bolton turned on Trump. That kind of makes sense. I get it. But what I don't get are the Never Trumpers. Jeffrey Toulis is a Never Trumper, writes at the Bulwark, says, Bolton sat on information vital to the fate of the United States, it seems, in order to enhance his own financial well-being. So he can't catch a break. Even people who hate the president, hate him, say that he's cashing in. Nancy Pelosi said, he was so arrogant in terms of the House when we were engaged in the impeachment. So the Democrats hate him. Never Trump Republicans hate him. Pro-Trump Republicans hate him. If anybody is the ultimate troll, it is John Bolton, and I think he's enjoying the attention. What is your sense on that?
Well, I think it's interesting. You brought up something that makes sense from a political standpoint, and that we should give a little bit more context. John Bolton obviously is what most of us would term a neocon. He is a very hawkish individual.
Yes, he's very hawkish. Yeah.
He basically hasn't seen a war he doesn't like. That was the advice. In fact, actually, related to that, I have an article here that shows a little bit more consistency instead of the sort of more cynical nature that you were talking about. Like, I can see these neocons flipping on Bolton because they feel he betrayed the president. Okay, I understand that politically, but that ideology is pretty deficient. I think we both agree with that, right? Because these guys are still neocons. They still supported Bolton's policies. They're just upset that Bolton, quote unquote, betrayed the president, which I kind of think he did, to be honest with you. I think I think as a person, I think he's kind of deplorable. That's just my opinion. But when it comes to the ideology, these are some people I think we champion. Thomas Massey, that's my favorite congressman. Okay, I won't say that I'm unbiased here. He is my favorite congressman. And who is he complimenting? None other than my favorite Senator Rand Paul. And this is a tweet, and I shared this tweet on our Twitter. And Congressman Massey said, if, as John Bolton supposedly implies in his book, Rand Paul convinced Donald Trump not to make John Bolton his Secretary of State, then Rand Paul deserves the Nobel Peace Prize and a thank you from the President of the United States. And this actually goes into an article that talks about that supposedly one of the big reasons that John Bolton wasn't a Secretary of State was because of Rand Paul. But also, folks will remember the incident with Iran, where the Iranians bombed a U.S. base in Iraq, I believe. And there was a moment where John Bolton was advising the president to go ahead and basically do a very disproportionate bombing on Iran. And the president made the call that was too much loss of life, and he was not going to do it. And that was also touted apparently in the book, that he thought the president was so weak for doing that, for not killing all these innocent people. And the fact that he knew Rand Paul, or the president knew Rand Paul would very much oppose these actions, and that was one of the reasons that it didn't happen. So in terms of ideological consistency, Rand Paul has consistently said that Bolton was a terrible idea and that he never should have been in the administration to begin with.
On that issue, we've talked about Iran on the show before. That Radio Farda is the Iranian Voice of America affiliate. And we were wondering, because John Bolton left right before all of that so-called saber rattling happened with Iran, that really didn't lead to anything. And one of the news outlets that was suggesting that we might be going to war with Iran and implied that Trump was a warmonger and, said some really, strange things about the president. You and I talked about that why are they doing that? Is this a way to kind of psych out your opponent, to kind of, after Soleimani was killed, is this a way to say, back off, we're crazy, we might do anything? And, or is this like is Voice of America anti-Trump? Is it run by anti-Trump people, which is really odd because their only job is not to talk to Americans, it's to talk to foreign nationals. And here they are attacking the American president. It was very strange. And I don't know if you saw over the weekend, all those people were fired. The heads of Voice of America were fired.
Didn't you tweet that story on Twitter?
Yes, I did.
I did see that. Yeah. I did see. I saw your tweet. Yeah, it's interesting, but it also gets into it. Kind of also, well, it's a little different, but you also see that with NPR. NPR has very biased articles as well against the president, and quite frankly, on almost every issue.
Yeah, NPR, we're almost, just kind of numb to it at this point. I don't know about you, but that's just what NPR is and what they have been for a very long time.
I'm sorry, did I lose the connection there for a little bit?
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, I'm just saying, no, I'm kind of numb to what NPR is doing because they've been that way for so long that you sort of expect it. Voice of America, these people were Republican appointees. No indication that they were radical, never Trump types, and yet they turned on the president. And honestly, I'm not sorry that they're gone because that's not supposed to be a political job. It's supposed to be, they say politics ends at the water's edge. That wasn't their job to get involved in domestic politics like that. They went way off script. They're supposed to be enacting our foreign policy agenda to some extent, being soft power in the region to promote democracy and American ideals, not to weigh in on the president.
Yeah, I would agree with you there.
So, yeah, that was really, really unfortunate. So I think to kind of sum this up, the John Bolton thing has made everybody insane. It's been an insane 3.5 years so far, and we can expect the next 4 months of campaigning to be really brutal, really intense. We saw just brutal ads over the weekend related to the Tulsa rally. People are talking about that, really ripping the president. We haven't even talked about that. There's just too much happening. We are in the 24-hour media spin cycle. I had a whole riff on how if Trump wins the election in November, it would be like the 2004 American League Championship Series. You remember when the Red Sox came back from a 3-0 deficit to beat the Yankees in 7 games? Are you a baseball fan?
I'm not a baseball fan, Pete.
Okay. Yeah. With the latest polls, if Trump is able to come back at this point, it would be a historic comeback. I think it's probably, maybe it's good that for him that everybody is throwing tomatoes at John Bolton, because it means they're not throwing tomatoes at him this week. He's not the center of controversy. John Bolton is. So
we do have an event though that's coming up. Here in Arizona. I'm based in Arizona, and Students for Trump does have a rally tomorrow. So an address to young Americans featuring Donald J. Trump. That's tomorrow, June 23rd. It says Phoenix. It's actually in Cave Creek. They actually have the address here for anyone that's interested. It does say that if you want to attend, the gates will open at 6 a.m. The doors will open at 11 a.m. But I don't think he actually speaks until something like 2 or 3 in the afternoon. So be prepared for a long day if you decide to do this. But I don't know. You mentioned Tulsa, and there was a lot of reports that the crowds weren't too bad for that. I actually have a friend who wants to attend that rally, and I may go if I can carpool with him. I may decide to go, and if I do, I'll try to film it. So
yeah. Well, I bought some tickets on TikTok, so
there you go.
All right. Well, I think that's all we have for today. We're running a little bit late, but I think it's been a good discussion tonight, as always. I'm Pete Maines. This is, as always, my co-host Eric Alexander, and until next week, you keep flying free.